Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's at least afternoon at the time of this recording. Well, I guess it's evening now. Feels like it's afternoon because the sun's out. We'll be out for a while because it's summer. So yeah, in this video, I'm going to be going through the 4 different temperaments, and those are the like phlegmatic. Blanking right now on the different ones. Oh, phlegmatic, sanguine, melancholy, and choleric, right? I'm sure you've heard of these different temperaments, and you may have even heard that this is like a pseudoscience sort of thing. And I'm going to explain in this video why the 4 temperaments aren't a pseudoscience, and why we have to accept that they do in fact exist, or rather that the abstraction that we make is a true abstraction. Sorry, I'm being a little bit vague. This is I started getting into this topic this week because I heard a description of the temperaments, and that was completely different than I had ever heard before, which was describing what the temperaments actually are and how to understand them. And I thought, hey, that's true and actually very useful in understanding oneself and others around them. And so I'm just going to describe that. This is probably going to be more than one video, just because once I started getting into this and once I started like breaking this down, I was like, whoa, there's a lot here. This is a rabbit hole. Like, I did not have time to even finish what I was starting today, and I don't even think I'm going to get through the entirety of what I have written here. So, yeah, so the 4 temperaments. We have the melancholy, we have the phlegmatic, the choleric, and the sanguine. Okay, so if you've never heard of these before, just a quick sort of explanation of probably the popular notion of what these things mean. And I think nowadays these terms aren't as popular because they've kind of gone out of fashion, because you're taught in school, oh, this is all nonsense or whatever. And if you're a psychology student, you learn about the big 5, which are about the personality types. And these 4 temperaments are not personality types. Okay, that's not what they are. Your personality is different than your temperament. And if, let's say, you could contradict that and say by definition they're the same thing, well, then let's use a different word then, because the 4 temperaments are describing something different than your personality. They are not describing your personality. If we look at the big 5, which is, I believe, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and, okay, it's open, extroversion, agreeableness, and then neuroticism, right? Those describe something completely different than the temperaments, okay? So, yeah, so what do the temperaments describe? Well, before I answer that, let me do what I was going to initially do here before I got sidetracked, which is to describe the traditional or not the traditional, but the common understanding, the popular understanding, the popular culture understanding of these terms. And that is, okay, they take the example of like the rock in the middle of a path. This is the one I've heard where, okay, so the phlegmatic comes upon the rock and he's just like, whatever, And by rock, I mean like a boulder that's blocking a path, right? You're on a journey and there's a boulder that's blocking your path, and the phlegmatic's like, whatever, I don't know. It's, and just doesn't even do anything about it. Okay, that's the phlegmatic. Or that's the popular description of the phlegmatic. The melancholy comes upon this rock and is like, oh no, this rock has ruined my entire life. This rock is just, I can't deal with this rock. I'm just going to sit here and cry and hope that this problem gets solved somehow. The choleric comes upon this rock and is Like, let's deal with this. Come on, guys. Let's all get together and deal with this problem. Let's move the rock out of the path or climb over it or whatever, right? Let's get this problem dealt with. And then the Sanguine comes along the path and is like, hey guys, it's a party. Yay, rock. This is a good chance to, let's relax. Everyone's here trying to deal with the rock. Let's all just have a party. So again, this is sort of the description. The other description I've heard was like, the idea of a house fire where you have like the phlegmatic person who's like, house is on fire, I guess. And then you have like the melancholy person who's like, oh no, the house is on fire. Like, I can't deal with this. The Sanguine is like, yeah, the house is on fire. Let's get some marshmallows, roast some marshmallows, blah, 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 blah. And then the Choleric is like the one trying to deal with the problem. Again, sort of like that similar tune. I may not be describing this popular notion exactly, right? But this is sort of what I've heard. And, I've had numerous people sort of describe this to me, and I've even seen this on websites and stuff. So that is the popular notion of the four temperaments, right? So just to briefly summarize that would be that the phlegmatic is sort of like the laid back person. The Sanguine is like the life of the party. The Choleric is like the really intense dude that's always trying to like get everyone to like do something. And then the Melancholy is the person that's just distraught over things and just, one thing ruins their entire day sort of thing. Okay, now that is not necessarily correct. There's some things in there that you could, once you describe what a temperament actually is, there's some things in there that would be kind of true, like especially with the phlegmatic person. Okay, so what then are the four temperaments? Or rather, how do we understand what the four temperaments are and where they come from? Now, historically, we could get into that. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not even sure where this conception of the four temperaments is that I'm going to present to you comes from, because I wasn't really able to find that anywhere. But the idea with the four temperaments has to do with the way in which, not you react, this is important, but the way in which, the strength of your impressions in the long term and in the short term. So the strength of your impressions in the immediate sense and then in the long term. Okay, now this is important. I'm going to try to describe this very clearly, or as clearly as I can, and so that you understand this, because this is very important. And I'm going to show you in this video that once we accept this, it naturally follows that these temperaments do in fact exist, right? Okay, now let's think about what I just said. I said impressions, the strength of impressions in the short term and in the long term. Okay, now we say that there's two sorts of impressions you can have. You can have either a weak impression or a strong impression. And then after that, you can have a weak impression initially and a long impression, or a strong or weak impression in the long term, right? Now, if you think about that, that would naturally sort of follow that there's four different types of people. One person who has a weak impression in the short term and a weak impression in the long term. One person who has a weak impression in the short term and a strong impression in the long term. Another person who has a strong impression and then strong and weak, right? So there's four there, right? Because there's two sets of two variables, right? Which, 2 to the power of 2 is 4. Okay, so what do we mean by impression? This is where we're going to start describing this. What we do not mean, let's be clear about this, is reaction, okay? And it depends what we mean by reaction. Sometimes people say reaction and it means impression. And sometimes people, like for example, when we say impression, we mean something like your emotional response to a given situation. Okay, now I don't necessarily think impression is limited to that, but that's sort of what we mean, is your emotional response, which is kind of like a reaction. However, reaction also means what you do in response to your response. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, if somebody insults you, you could be offended by that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do something about that or you're going to say anything back, right? So just because you have an impression does not mean that that necessarily follows that there's a reaction. So we don't mean your reaction, we mean your impression. Okay, so that's what an impression is then. It's, something like, but not necessarily limited to, our emotional understanding of an event, our emotional response to an event. And I'm using language like an event because I'm trying to make abstractions out of reality instead of just always giving specifics. You want to be able to make abstractions to understand things. And so what that means is our emotional understanding of an event. It's like, so think, for example, of, oh, actually, no, an impression would be, it's not just our emotional understanding. It's because we're talking about the strength of the impression here when we're talking about temperaments. When we're talking about the impression, we're not talking about the sort of impression, which is completely different. For example, when someone insults you, I mean, you can have, different people can have different impressions, and that doesn't mean that they have different strengths of impressions, right? Okay, so I have the example here of, if somebody insulted you, and let's say somebody called you a doofus or something like that, right? They're like, you're a doofus. Well, or a dorcas or something, like one of these insults that might just make you laugh, right? You might not even be insulted by that, right? Because that's, it's just kind of funny. Okay. Because if we're understanding where we're coming from with the temperaments, what we understand then is that if you think something's funny, like somebody insulting you is funny in a certain circumstance, that doesn't mean that you're having a weak or strong impression or given to weak and strong impressions just based off of that, right? I mean, you could have two people that are both called doofus and both of them think it's funny, but one person just thinks it's way funnier than the other person does, right? And again, this gets really complicated really fast because there's so many different scenarios we can think of. This is why we're trying to think in abstractions. And so we're saying all things being equal, given the understanding of the event, the emotional understanding of the event, the impression we're talking about is whether there's a strong emotional reaction or a weak one, right? Given our understanding of the event. So, yeah, so again, we can just describe this easily. Here's a very easy example. We probably all know a person who, when they hear a joke or they've, any sort of comedy, they just kind of like chuckle. They're like, haha, that's funny. And you've never seen this person like laugh really, really hard. And we can all think, I'm assuming we can all think of a person like that, right? Where they never really laugh that hard. Okay, and so that would be a person that's like maybe phlegmatic, right? Because they're having a weak impression of things. So they're still finding the joke funny. They just, that's funny. And then we can all think of a person who only belly laughs at things, only just really laughs their gut out when they hear something funny. And they're just very, that's, we can think of, okay, by the way, there's a good pun here I'm going to make. But, that would be an example of a person who's having a very strong impression, right? So again, we see in this, we're not talking necessarily about the sort of impression. We're just saying whether the impression's weak or strong, okay? And then based off of that, we're getting the temperaments. You can be kind of sad or really sad. You can be kind of angry or really angry, and we can do this for the different sorts of impressions of events. And that's what we're talking about when we're speaking about temperament. Okay. So before I move on, let's just, explain what these 4 temperaments then are. Okay. Now that I've explained what an impression is, what do we mean then when we're saying that there's 4 different types? Okay. Well, again, like I said, you can have the weak impression in the short term and a strong impression in the long term, right? Or any variable thereof. Well, okay, the 4 different types then are phlegmatic, and that is understood as being a weak impression in the short term and a weak impression in the long term. Then you have the melancholy, who has a weak impression in the short term and a strong impression in the long term. Now, next week's video, we're going to go through this and try to work out, well, what would this then mean, right? Like what does it mean to be melancholy? What sort of problems might you have, or something like that. We're going to try to break this down even further and get into this. Okay. So then the sanguine person has a strong impression in the short term and a weak impression in the long term, right? So, if they get insulted or something, or they get offended by something in the moment, like somebody calls them a doofus, and let's say, or not a doofus because that was the thing that was making them laugh, but let's say somebody says something insulting to them and they get angry and they go, they respond. They're just not going to be that angry about it the next day. They dealt with it in the moment and it's over and done with. And then you have the last one, which is the choleric, which is a strong impression and strong impression. Strong in the short term, strong in the long term, right? Now, how do we know that these temperaments exist? Well, think about it. Just ask yourself this question. Is there such a thing as varying degrees of impressions to different circumstances? Can you be sort of a little bit angry or a lot angry? Is there different varying degrees of impressions? And I don't mean if we all experience the same circumstance and all have the same understanding of it, do you think we're all going to have the same strength of impression? Well, not necessarily, right? No. If you answer no, then it's just going to naturally follow that these 4 temperaments exist. Because, again, once we understand that there's different strengths of impressions, then we can understand that, oh, well, that would imply that there's 2 types of people, those who have strong impressions and those who have weak impressions. But then when we say, well, maybe there's people who have strong impressions in the present, but then later on, the impression's kind of weak. And then maybe there's people who have weak impressions in the present, but then maybe later on, it's kind of strong. Okay, if we then admit that there's, your impressions can vary depending on time, your impressions can change over time or not change, in the case of the phlegmatic and the choleric, well, then it would again imply that there's just 4 different temperaments. There's 4 different types of people. And it just naturally follows, right? Just mathematically, that's the way it has to be. Now, let's go into this, because then the question is well, why two types of strengths of impression? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why not 5, right? Well, I'm sure we could do 5 different types, but then that implies that there's 25 different types of people, and that might not be the most useful way of looking at the world, right? Yeah, oh, and by the way, strength of impression does not mean type of impression. This is very important, right? So again, just because somebody who has strong impressions in the present is insulted does not mean that person's going to get angry, right? Because again, the example of, oh, you're a doofus, right? That might make a person laugh, right? So it really, that more depends on the person's personality type, maybe, or, that depends on other things. So when we say strong impressions, we're not saying what the impressions are going to be, just that if they're there, they're going to be strong, right? And the same with weak. We're not saying that, a phlegmatic person is never angry. Well, that would be, no, because that would be to say that they never have the impression of anger, right? Or that a phlegmatic person is never sad. Well, no, that would just be to say that they never have the impression of being sad. It just means that when they're sad, they're like less sad. Um, Now, again, this gets a little bit complicated because, people can look at this and be like, okay, so the phlegmatic person, their mom dies, are they not going to have a strong emotional response to that? I'm like, yes, in relationship to themselves, right? But in relationship to other people, maybe not. And, or, if, the sanguine person's mom dies, are you saying that they're just going to cry for one day and then they're not going to have this impression that their mom's dead? I'm like, well, no, that's not what that means, right? With that one, it's a little bit different because we're talking about something that, like, everyone's going to have strong emotional responses to if you like your mom, right? Or I mean, just in general, that's just something that's part of a human nature that we're kind of connected with our mothers and fathers, right? Um, whether that connection is negative or positive is a different story. But yeah, just because someone is upset that their mom dies does not mean that the person's like sanguine or choleric. Everyone is going to be upset by the fact that their mom is dead, has died. It's the varying degree of reactions that we're talking about. And again, with the one, because the thing with, let's say, your mom dying, your impressions of that, I don't think anyone can escape long-term impressions. And so with something like that, unless they just have like amnesia or something. But I might look at that in a different video because I think that one's, I'm going to have to work that one out a little bit because it's kind of hard to explain. But yeah. So yeah, what I'm saying is just because someone has what seems to be a strong emotional reaction to something or a strong emotional response does not mean that they are given to strong impressions. Because again, even with anyone, you're going to react stronger and weaker to certain things depending on the circumstance and depending on your understanding of it. So what this then means is in the temperament, we're actually comparing people to other people, right? So if you're having a weak reaction in the moment, and actually to yourself as well, but that's a little bit different. If you have a weak reaction in the moment, it means that you have a weak reaction in relation to people who are having strong reactions. Or you're having a weak reaction in relation to what you're having later. And that's, let's say, if you're melancholy, it's kind of easy to tell that you're melancholy for yourself because you have this pattern of having like weak reactions in the moment. Let's say somebody does something and it might kind of upset you, but then later is when you're really upset about it. That describes a melancholy person, because they're having this weak reaction in the moment, and then later on they're having a strong reaction. I'm using the word reaction, but impression in the moment. Then later they're having a strong impression, and so yeah. Whereas if you're a sanguine person, you're going to have like a strong impression in the moment, and then a weak one later on. And so you can compare those strengths to each other in that. Now, I forgot to answer what I was previously going to answer, which was why two? Why two, reaction strengths of reactions? Why not three? Why not four? Why not five? And then I said, hey, for every one we add, we multiply the amount. We're exponentially increasing the amount of personality types, and that might not be the most useful. But there's another reason. And let me just try to find this here. Okay. So why are impressions either strong or weak and not right in the middle, right? Why can't we have say that there's 3 types or 4 or whatever, right? Okay, so the first thing we need to understand about this is when we're thinking about the types of impression is not to think of it like weak and strong over here and then like kind of going towards each other like this. I mean, we do kind of need to think about it like that. Like it is a scale, but we also need to see it that there's like a 0 point here and then the strong here and then the weak here. And that's because the scale is going from 0, which is no impression, all the way up to strong. And because if we conceptualize it as weak, strong, and then going towards each other in the middle, at that middle point is where it's being canceled out. And that's like a weird thing. You might not understand why I'm explaining it that way, but if you can conceptualize it like that, the scale like that, it just means that there's no such thing as no impression, and it's just incorrect. Yeah, it means that on the scale from strong to weak, in the middle, there's just no impression. And when you conceptualize it like that, it kind of ruins the entire paradigm, right? It ruins the entire thing. And so you have to conceptualize it as weak here, strong here, and then 0 right at the point of right here, right? So going from strong to weak, there's this 0 point, which is called no impression. And you have to conceptualize it like that. Or you get the no impression right in the middle between strong and weak, which is just incorrect. And I'm saying that because I was doing that in my mind. And then I realized that that wasn't the right way to conceptualize it. Okay, so that's point 1 on middle point. So when we're talking about a middle point, we don't mean no impression. No impression is on over here. Okay, so middle point does not mean no impression. Okay, the other points here is that, okay, we could ask the same thing about length of time, right? We could say the same, why just short term and long term? Why not like short term, medium term, longer term? You know, and I assume we could do that, but is it going to be the most useful? And again, every one we add, we're just making the amounts grow exponentially, and that might not be the most useful way of viewing the world, classifying things, okay? Also, though, there's another point here which is very important, which is that when we're making abstractions dealing with scales of things, which is what we're doing when we're saying strong and weak, we're dealing with a scale, because it's like a sliding scale. You can go from weak to strong. When we're making abstractions like that about scales, doing that in a binary sense of the scale is the simplest and therefore the best method of making those abstractions, because it's the simplest. Which is because when we make an abstraction of a scale and we do it in a binary sense, it's the most certain sense. It's the most certain abstraction. It's not necessarily the most indicative of that scale, but it's the most certain. Meaning that if we don't know how many points are along that scale, but we know that there is a scale there, it means that there's at least 2. And so when we say 2, when we have a strong and weak, we are most likely, or it is the most certain we can become, right? Okay, so, okay, so we're certain that there's at least 2 strengths because we know that you can have different strengths, which means that there's at least 2. Okay. Yeah, and then we also know that it's going to be useful. We're most certain that it's useful because depending on the amount of points in the scale, the abstraction we make based off of that will change in usefulness. And if we make we make an abstraction that there's 2 points, that becomes the most likely to be useful, right? Whereas, let's say something like 3 or 4 might not actually be useful. Thus, the abstraction is absolutely true and certainly useful. Okay, that's what we know. If we're making abstractions about any sort of scale, any sort of differential like that, with 2 points, we are most certain of it, most certain of the abstraction. That's as certain as we can become of the abstraction without further evidence. And we know that it's the most certainly useful. It's most likely to be useful. Whereas once we start adding, again, if we don't have any other evidence, like 3 might just not be useful at all. And we know this because we're dealing with a scale. So whereas if we are to abstract 3 or more, it is not absolutely true, right? Because what if we make an abstraction of a scale having 4 points and there's only 3 points in the scale? Well, then it's just not even true. The abstraction's not true. And it's not even necessarily useful, right? By absolutely true, what we mean is that it's not describing the entirety of the scale, it's abstracting it. We're making an abstraction from the scale. That's what it's true in the abstractive sense. Okay. And since the abstraction made is the simplest, it's also the easiest to understand, right? And so that's why we're going to deal with weak and strong impressions rather than going like sort of weak, kind of weak, all the way up to like really, really, really strong, because it's the simplest to understand when we make that abstraction, and it gives us the fewest number of options for people. It's also the most likely to be correct, or it's definitely true, and it's the most likely to be useful given all the evidence. So I'm going to end the video there. I hope that was somewhat informative, and I'll continue next time, and hopefully I do a little bit better of a job at explaining things. So yeah, take care.